And join me in welcoming Brad Nelson to our stage.
How you guys doing? Good Sunday afternoon? I watched the Colts game. Maybe we'll just leave it at that. Brad Gray is my colleague and one of my very best friends. We both met as freshmen at Cornerstone University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He was a basketball player and I was a soccer player. And we started learning to preach and teach together. Gosh, it probably was sometime around 2005, 2006. And we always had it in our mind, like maybe someday we could do something together. And I served as a pastor for about 20 years, and 10 years in Michigan, 10 years in Florida. And then Brad had moved to Nashville and launched the organization that I'm now a part of, Walking the Text. And so we do we teach people how to read the Bible in its original context. And we invite people to think about that through these 6 lenses. So what do we mean when we say context? We mean history. We mean geography. We mean culture, language, literary design, and then the visual backgrounds. Because there is just something about adding a visual. When we see something, our memory of it jumps like 65%. And so when we are inviting people to really begin to wrestle with what does this text mean in its context, we all want to answer the question, and it's an important question. What does this mean for me? What does this Bible passage mean for me? But if we will first do the work to ask, and this is really what responsible Bible reading I think is all about, do the work to ask, what did this mean for them then? What you will find is that you will get richer, deeper, more nuanced, and more specific answers to the question, what does this mean for me now? And so we get to do that work. We have got a podcast. We do like video teachings. We lead trips to Israel and to Turkey. I'm really disappointed that we're not leading trips there right now. But I do want to start tonight by showing you one of the places that we do take people to. And I want to frame it for you this way. As we go deeper into the book of 1 Peter, I want to start by just showing you an overview, and this is done by the Bible Project. If you're not familiar with the Bible Project, I assume many of you are. By the way, I just want a quick rabbit trail. One of the things that we will often hear at Walking the Text when we talk to people about reading the text in context is people will say to us, I never knew this. How did I get this far along in following Jesus and I've never heard this? And people get a little miffed sometimes. And one of the biggest questions that we hear is, where are churches that are talking about this kind of stuff? And I can just tell you from our end of things as like an organization that helps with churches, it is such a gift to be able to say, oh, are you in Indiana? Are you near Indianapolis? Because there is this really cool community of people, and you can learn this stuff there. And you guys have that at this church, and it is a real gift. And so I'm just glad that you get to experience that. But one of the first things, if you are reading a text, that is super, super helpful to do to get an understanding of what is the literary design, what is the flow of this text. The Bible Project has a graphic piece of artwork like this that is an overview for every single book of the Bible, and you can download them for free. And so this just gives you an idea of the narrative flow of 1 Peter, and I'm not going to take you through it. Really, what I want you to see is that the book of 1 Peter has really one big core idea. It is the drumbeat, it is the central theme that Peter is going to talk about from start to finish, and that is this theme of how to suffer well. And here's why that's interesting. Because when we first meet Peter in the Gospels, he doesn't have a lot of patience for the idea of suffering. And really to understand and appreciate what Peter is saying in the letter of 1 Peter, it is so important to understand a little bit about Peter's life and background and experience with Jesus. So I want to start in Matthew chapter 16, where Peter has a conversation with Jesus at a place called Caesarea Philippi. And here's a picture of Caesarea Philippi. Just out of curiosity, how many of you here have been to the land of Israel? Okay, this is one of the coolest sites. And you can actually go to Israel right now, even with the conflict being such as it is, but there's one site you can't go to because it's too dangerous, and that is Caesarea Philippi. It's way in the north. It's near where Hezbollah is launching, all the rockets. But Jesus brings his disciples here to this particular place in order to ask a question. And this is where we see this first kind of waffling of Peter over the kind of life that Jesus has called him to. And so Jesus and the disciples came to the district of Caesarea Philippi, and he asked them this question: who do people say that the Son of Man is? And Simon, who is Peter, the one is always first to answer, he says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. He's the first one to accurately discern who Jesus is and what Jesus is up to. And this is a big deal. And Jesus really responds to this by saying, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. Now here's why this is so cool. Jesus is always incredibly intentional. When he says the gates of Hades, in a first century kind of Greco-Roman mindset, Hades is the underworld. And the way you get to the underworld is through a gateway. It's through a cave. And what you have at Caesarea Philippi is this gaping hole at the foot of this mountain. And in the first century, there was a spring that gushed up out of the ground there and spewed water out. And the remains that you see here outside of around this cave, there was pagan worship happening to Caesar Augustus, and there was a temple to the god Pan. And so there's all of this pagan worship happening here at this cave because they saw it as the gates of Hades. And Jesus brings his disciples there, asks, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, you are absolutely right. And you are Peter. And on this rock, I'm going to build my church. And that's not going to prevail against you. Now, here's what's cool. During COVID, when tourists weren't in Israel, there was like a tremor, like an earthquake, and some stones fell out of the mouth of that cave, and they said, wait a second, there's something here. And they discovered that as early as like the late 300s, early 400s, the Christians, the followers of Jesus in the land of Israel, they built a church on top of the gates of hell. They took Jesus' words seriously and said, we're claiming this place for Jesus. I love that. That is just so cool. But it's this really high moment in Peter's life where he recognizes who Jesus is, and Jesus says, yes, Peter, you're right, and you're the future of this movement. And then it goes to Peter's head. Because what does Peter do next? Well, the text tells us Jesus goes on after this, and from that time on, he began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering. And you know how the story goes. What does Peter think of this plan? Lord. Peter pulls him aside and rebukes him. If you're taking notes, this is an important one. If you're rebuking Jesus, you're out of line, okay? And Jesus tells him, get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking about God's plans. You are thinking about what you are up to. And so the first time there is this intense encounter between Jesus and Peter, Peter is reacting to say, I am not okay with suffering. That is not the path. And approximately 30 years later, Peter will go to the cross in Rome, And because, according to Christian tradition, he doesn't feel worthy to die like Jesus, he asks to be crucified upside down. And he goes to suffer willingly. And shortly before he does that, he writes this letter to the church in Asia where he says to them, I want you to suffer well. What happens in his life to move him from Jesus, that's a bad idea, to everybody, I want you to live like this, and I would like to be crucified upside down? What changes? And in a word, disappointment. Peter experiences disappointment in his discipleship to Jesus. Because what Peter and what most first century Jews expected was a military conqueror king who was going to defeat the Romans and claim the throne for himself and launch a Jewish theocratic state. That was the goal. That was what a Messiah should do. And what Peter got, what he experienced, was a crucified Lord. And that was hard for him to accept. And I just think you could say that disappointment is that thing that exists in the gap between our expectations and our experience. Now, it's interesting. I was reading an article, this would have been, 3 or 4 years ago now, but there was a photojournalist who was just exploring what happens to us in this gap between expectation and experience. And this photojournalist started taking pictures of bronze medal winners at the Olympics and their excitement, because they were often not expected to win a medal, but somehow they had edged onto the medal podium and they exceeded their expectations. And what did you think happened when he took pictures of the silver medalists? The silver medalists often were the ones who were expected to win, but for some reason they got edged out, and so instead of gold, they got silver. And so you have people who win a bronze and their experience exceeds their expectations, and then you have people who win a silver and their experience is not at all what they expected. How many of you know this space between expectation and experience, right? There's what you expect taking your kids to Disney is going to be like. You're riding the rides, everybody's happy, these are like fun family memories, the kids are getting along, and then you get to Disney and it's a disaster. Everybody's mad. The kids have not slept. There's too much sugar in their system. The lines are long. People are rude. You think, why did we spend all this money on this? Actually, my wife, we lived 45 minutes from Disney, and we took our kids twice. After the second time, they asked us never to go back. I'm thinking that some of it had to do with my own maturity level as a father, because my wife snapped a picture of me the last time we were there and just got a picture of my experience there. We got trapped by one of those Disney parades, and so I'm like hunched up in a corner. People are running over my toes with strollers. I've got the dad donkey thing going. I'm carrying all the things, half-eaten suckers. My daughter's eating a melting ice cream cone that's dropping in my arm hair, and it's just a disaster. So there's what you expect, and then there's what you experience. How many of you, there's how you expected your life to go? First I did this, and it was awesome. And then I moved to the next stage, and it was great. And just up and to the right, and then you got into life. And I guess we're doubling back, we're rounding up, and it's just not at all what we expect. And here's what we need to wrestle with as we think about this change in Peter. Most of the time, people who witness powerfully to the work of God in their life are the people who are most honest and willing to wrestle with their disappointment with God. And that is what Peter had to do. And I just want to, I want to make this really granular. So it's a picture of my wife and my girls. This is Braylon there standing next to me. She's just gone off to college. Clara is our 14-year-old, and then Charlotte's our 8-year-old. And this is my lovely wife, Trisha. But when we had our girls, we made a decision as a family that we wanted my wife to be home. We wanted her to be available to be with the girls as they grew up. And so she stepped away from a career that she really enjoyed. And of course, now we're, 17 years in, 18 years in, and we're starting to get a little freedom back in our life. And my wife is feeling this call. It's like the Spirit is blowing, and she has all of this giftedness in her that she wants to offer the world. And she has pursued a couple, like 3 different certifications. She has pursued multiple relationships. She has put herself out there, and we're going on 4 years, and nothing has worked. And when I pray for her, and she's got a job right now, and it's fine for now, but it is not even close to what she longs for. And she's been praying for 4 years. And every day when I pray for her, I pray, God, would you just give her like a little glimpse, a little down payment now of the thing that she's longing for? Would you remember her? But she's wrestling with disappointment, and this is part of following Jesus. Things do not always go the way that we expect, and reality happens in that space where we wrestle with this stuff with Jesus. That's very often where our heart gets changed. And one of the things that, like 3 of the things actually that my wife is learning is she's learning to see delay as preparation. She's learning to see, okay, if it's not now, God, I trust that you are, like we say in the Lord's Prayer, that you are in fact a good father, that you know where you're taking me, and that it's somewhere good, even though I can't see it. So I am going to choose to remind myself of that every day and remember that this delay, this disappointment, that you are preparing me for something. But also she's looking at this adversity as an invitation to intimacy. There is just something about when we get away with one another and we struggle together and we bleed together, that builds connection and community faster than almost anything. And that is also true about our life with God. When we struggle, it builds connection. And also this idea of memory as a springboard to the future. The most often repeated command in the scriptures is remember. And the reason for that is you often look at the future as if you're moving into the unknown, but really what the Jewish people did is they said, move into the future with your eyes on the past. Because God's past faithfulness is the surest indicator of his future faithfulness. And if you're always looking at what's unknown, you're going to go into the future wondering, like, what's going to happen? But if you move into the future with your eyes on all the ways that God's met you in the past, it totally changes the journey for you. And so disappointment, it drives us to these places where we really have to wrestle with the difference between what we expected and what we experienced. And very often what we find is that we were holding on to something small when God, in fact, was trying to do something much bigger. And so what you see in Peter's life is that Peter expected a God who was going to conquer the Romans. But what Peter got, what he experienced, was a God who was going to conquer sin and death. God is playing a much bigger game, and you are being invited to it. So when you experience disappointment, can you begin to see it as this invitation to depth? There's a pastor in Grand Rapids, Michigan, by the name of Jeff Mannion at Ada Bible Church, and he just has this question. I love this so much. He says, The question when it comes to Jesus is, are you following Jesus to get where he's going, or are you following Jesus to get where you're going? Is Jesus a mascot or a prop in your agenda, or are you a disciple following where he's trying to lead you? Because if you're a disciple following where he's trying to lead you, then brothers and sisters, sometimes that's going to lead you to places you don't want to go. I don't know why, but very often, God in his kindness and in his severe mercy takes us right through rather than around the things that we most do not want to address. And it's interesting, when Jesus and Peter are restored in John chapter 21 on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus says these words to him, "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, when you stretch out your hands, someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." And so often this is what the process of maturity does. It's allowing Jesus to take us to those places we'd rather not go, so that he can expose things in our heart and form and shape us into the person he intends for us to be. And so the change that happens in Peter is that Peter is able to learn to see disappointment as an invitation to a larger story. And the same, I think, will be true for us if we can begin to be honest about our disappointment with God and begin to see it, reframe it in this way. It's going to make the journey much, much more powerful for us. And because I'm a story geek, and I just feel like when we can take a big idea like this and embed it in a story, it just helps. So I want to give you an example of how I have seen this lived out. This is a woman by the name of Sue Burns. Sue Burns, in the late 80s, was diagnosed with a really, really aggressive form of arthritis. And it was so bad that within the span of just a couple of years, she was completely bedridden. So much pain that she could not even sit upright in a wheelchair. And essentially, the diagnosis was, you are confined to lay on your back in a hospital bed for the rest of your life. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm the kind of person, I don't even like being home on a Saturday. Okay? I got to be moving. I can't imagine what would happen inside me if that was my future. But what did Sue Burns do? Sue Burns, in the late 80s, had phone lines installed in her hospital room next to her bed. This was back in the days of like Commodore 64. She taught herself how to use a computer and how to read databases. And from her hospital bed, started calling and reaching out to other people in the UK who had been diagnosed with her same ailment. And she started calling them and just checking on them. And pretty soon, she built this database of other people. And pretty soon, she was kind of like the go-to person for, oh, this was your diagnosis. Here's what you can expect. Here's the doctors you need to talk to. Here's the people you need to talk to. And she built this entire help hotline in the UK. And near the end of her life, she became the first person in a hospital bed to be wheeled into Buckingham Palace to receive an MBE award from Her Majesty the Queen. And it would be so easy to have her story, to look at her story and to think, I wanted to grow old. I hoped this for myself. And yet God was up to something huge, huge. And it required her to enter into that disappointment and to relinquish and yield and say, okay, God, what is it that you are up to and how can I be a part of that? And that's what happens in Peter's life. And I think it's what makes him capable of talking about suffering to these Christians in the churches in Asia. So that will be our first one, just this idea that disappointment can become a doorway to incredible depth if you will allow it. I think one of the things that I want to do just as we move through tonight is leave some space in between each little one for comments and questions. It's really fun. Where I live in Georgia right now, there's this little country church that doesn't have a pastor. And so I teach there a couple times a month, and there's like 10 people. And so I'm used to being in this kind of setting where I'm on a stage and, like I'm a communicator mode and rhetorical questions. And I'll be like doing a sermon there and I'll rhetorical question and like 4 people will answer it. And it turns into a discussion. I'm like, oh, okay. And it's been so cool. So just want to leave some space here. Any thoughts, observations, questions about this idea in Peter's life? I'm also happy to just do rhetorical questions if that's... All right, we'll go ahead here. All right, so the second thing I want to look at in Peter's life is not just how he was able to reframe disappointment as an invitation to greater depth, but also how Peter really went through a pretty intense experience of failure. And I think that primed him to be able to write the kind of hard things that he wrote to these churches in Asia in the letter of 1 Peter. And so I want to walk you through kind of the character arc of Peter's life that we see in the Gospels and just kind of shine a spotlight on this excruciating experience of failure. So one of the first times that we meet Peter in John's gospel is in John chapter 1, verse 42. And we read this, he brought Simon to Jesus who, and there's this word that most of us just read right over, who looked at him. I want you to just tab that in your mind. Jesus looked at him. Hold on to that idea. We'll come back to it. So Jesus looked at him and then said, you are Simon, son of John. You are to be called Cephas, which is translated Peter. So Peter meets Jesus for the first time. There's this introduction. Hi, my name is Jesus. Hi, my name is Peter. Nope, that's not your name anymore. You're now C. I don't know if you've ever had that where you meet somebody, they're like, yeah, you don't seem like a Brad. You're actually a Greg. I'm going to call you Greg. That's sort of what Jesus does. But what we know from the Hebrew scriptures is that a name is like symbolic of your identity. It's who you are and why you're here. So actually, if you read through the book of Ruth, every character's name in the story is the role that they play in the story. So the 2 sons of Naomi and Elimelech, their names are Mahlon and Chilion. They die in the first act. Spoiler alert. Their names mean sickness and death. I don't know why anybody would name... apparently, what you would do in a Hebrew setting is you either had a hope that you wanted your child to live into, or you saw something about what your child was like as an infant and you named them accordingly. So probably these boys were pretty sickly from the time they were children and they were given those names. Later in the story, there's a Boaz wants to redeem. He wants to be the kinsman redeemer for Ruth. But there's another relative who's closer. And so Boaz talks to him. He says, hey, you're closer. You could redeem this estate. And he says, oh, yeah, I'll do it. And Boaz reminds him, oh, by the way, if you do that, you got to marry Ruth. And that little curveball means he'll lose money in the deal. And he says, whoa, hold on. Wait a second. Not interested. That's a bad investment. And it's funny, because he refuses to preserve Elimelech's name in the story, he isn't named. And in Hebrew, this guy is called, I kid you not, in the book of Ruth, Mr. So-and-so. Because he won't preserve Elimelech's name, he forfeits his own name in the story. It's crazy. So names in the Bible are incredibly important. And when you get a new name, it's an indication of a new mission, a new purpose. And so when Jesus names Peter Cephas, or rock, we know that it means rock, That is significant because when you look back into the Old Testament, there's somebody else that's called this. So in Isaiah chapter 51, we read this: "Listen to me, you that pursue righteousness, you that seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were hewn and to the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham your father." So God chooses for himself a family, the nation of Israel. But he first finds a man, Abraham, and says, I am going to build my nation, my people who are going to bless the world and show the world what I look like. I'm going to build them on you, and you're the foundation. You're the rock. And that is the name that Jesus gives to Peter. Now, I don't know if you have experienced this in life, but we don't come like into life fully capable of using our gifts. There is a developmental curve, right? And it's the same in Peter's life. And so when you look through the Gospels at the places where Jesus calls Peter this new name, there's a little bit of an arc. So in John chapter 1, he says, you will be. In other words, there's a point in the future where you're going to learn how to live into this identity. Then in Luke chapter 6, 12 through 14, he called him. It's almost like when I say to my girls, come on, you got this. You got this in you. I know you can do this. You will become this. You will be. He called him. And then at Matthew 16 at Caesarea Philippi, when he says, you're the Messiah, Jesus says, yes, there it is. Now you are. You have become the thing that I saw in you when I first met you. And he's got this character arc. And so Michael Card, who has written a biography on Peter, says this, that Peter is not merely an affectionate nickname, but a prophetic title describing who Simon will, by grace, become. How many of you know becoming the person that God intends for you to be is not always a clean and tidy process? How many of you have had to learn to be patient with yourself? To learn to see yourself with the same kind of eyes that God sees you with, and to remind yourself, I'm loved. I'm not a dumpster fire. Like, there is a story, there is a destination, and sometimes we just got to remind ourselves of this. And it's interesting because when you look at the words that are used in the New Testament to describe the process of transformation, they're rooted in this idea that we've all learned in high school about the metamorphosis, the chrysalis. And so what happens, and I never caught this before until I really wrestled with this text, but a caterpillar is born and it has within its body the DNA blueprint of a caterpillar. But located in its body are what are called imaginal cells. And those imaginal cells are the DNA blueprint for a butterfly, but they remain dormant. And if they were actually to become active, the caterpillar's body would attack it as if it were a foreign substance. And so who it's going to become is in there, but it's laying asleep. When a caterpillar goes into a cocoon, into a chrysalis, it undergoes this process of disintegration. It turns into this ooey, gooey, soupy nothingness. And if you were to put pressure on one of these before it was time for it to open, all that would come out would be this ooze, this brown substance. But there's something about that disintegration that activates the imaginal cells. And as the caterpillar disintegrates or dies, the imaginal cells get activated so that this organism now takes on this new identity and becomes what it had it in it to be all along. And when you look at this process of transformation, there are basically these three steps. There's first disintegration, then there's distillation down to its core essence, and then finally there is formation. And what you see in Peter's life with the failure that he experiences, you get to see Peter's disintegration. You get to see him distilled down to the person Jesus said someday you're going to be. And then you see him formed into that person that he's going to, by grace, become. And I just want to look and savor Peter's failure. And so Peter, of all the disciples, is the most rebuked disciple. In fact, in Jesus' last 24 hours, Peter is rebuked 5 times. 5 times in 24 hours. And if you do a careful reading of the New Testament and you get to know the disciple Peter, what you kind of come away with is he's sort of impetuous. He's got a little bit of an ego. He wants to be first. He wants to be the best. He's always the first to have an answer. He's usually tripping over himself and getting it wrong. And so he's got a pretty sensitive ego. But he gets rebuked more than anybody. And I'm curious, let's just do a little Bible trivia. Do any of you remember what's one of the rebukes that happens in the last 24 hours of Jesus' life? We'll do them in order. First one, Peter's seating assignment at the Last Supper. So for those of you who are here this morning, we talked about how in the first century, where you got seated at the table says something about your status. And that was actually true even at the Last Supper. And if you read John's account of the Last Supper closely, we can tell where 4 people sat. Jesus, as the host, would have been in the second position. We know that John laid his head back on Jesus' chest, which means John would have been in the first position. When Jesus said the person who's going to betray me is the one who's going to dip the bread in the bowl with me, because of the kind of table they were at, it would have had to have been Judas next to him in the guest of honor seat. How cool is that? Jesus knows he's going to betray him and he seats him in the guest of honor seat. But Peter, because of the way these tables are set up, he's the only other disciple who's close enough to hear the conversation. And that's because Peter is in the very last seat. And that was called the servant's seat. It was the lowest seat at the table. And what does John's gospel tell us? At the Last Supper, what were they arguing about? Who's the greatest? Which one of us is the greatest? And where does Peter get sat? In the servant seat. I promise you, he was burned up. He would have been hacked off by this. And he overhears this conversation and he asks, like, tell me, what's being said? What's being said? So he gets seated in this Last Supper seat. Now, when you are seated in the servant seat at a meal like that, there are certain responsibilities that come with that. The person in the servant seat is actually required to wash people's feet before the meal begins. But Peter doesn't. And I think he doesn't do it because he's irritated that that's where he got seated. He doesn't do what's expected of him. So during the meal, the host, Jesus, gets up, takes a towel, and does it instead. That never happens at a meal. And so I think the second rebuke is Jesus makes an object lesson out of Peter. He says, listen, if you're going to be the one on whom I'm building my future, it doesn't look like sitting at the top. It looks like serving at the bottom. And you didn't want to do it, so let me give you an object lesson right now. This is what it looks like to be at the top. It looks like being willing to get low. And I promise you, again, Peter would have felt hot coals on his head. It's another rebuke. Well, then, as the night goes on, as the meal goes on, Jesus announces to Peter, in front of everybody, you're going to deny me. And what is Peter's response? Never, Lord. I've learned from arguments with my teenagers that when people start bandying about words like always and never, they're usually emotionally flooded, right? They're not speaking rationally at this point. I'm guilty of this as well. Peter, never, Lord, I will never do that. And then within 12 hours, he does. And so Peter gets called out again. Yeah, you are going to deny me. And I promise you that smarted. They finish the meal. They leave the meal. They walk past the temple. They go down into the Kidron Valley, across the Kidron Valley, up into the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus, who's deeply troubled, takes his 3 closest disciples with him, Peter, James, and John, and he goes a little farther away, and he says to these guys, I am struggling right now, and I need to pray, but I want the 3 of you to stay with me and keep watch. Please stay here with me. Be with me in this moment of heartache. I'm going to go over there and pray. And Jesus does, and what happens when he comes back? They're asleep. And if you read the text, Jesus speaks to all of them, but his words are primarily directed at Peter, and he says to him, couldn't you even keep watch for an hour? It's just like this, it doesn't feel good. And then they come to arrest him, and what does Peter do? Whips out a sword, takes off Malchus, the high priest's servant's ear, and Jesus turns and rebukes him 5 times in the span of just a few hours. You are seeing Peter's rapid disintegration. And I want to read to you the most crushing moment from Luke chapter 22, and I'm going to start at verse 54. Then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. And when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Peter replied, "I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. And then there is this crushing line. The Lord turned and what? Looked at Peter. Now there's a lot of ways to say he looked at him in Greek. This is a unique one. You want to guess the other place it shows up? The first time Jesus ever meets Peter. He looked at him, and it's the same Greek word. It's this word, emblepo. Let me hear you say emblepo. It means not just to look at, but to look at searchingly, to look at significantly, to look at attentively. So when I go to the airport tomorrow morning and I hand my driver's license to the TSA, they are going to emblepo me. They're going to hold this up and they're going to scrutinize me. Are you who you say you are? And this is how Jesus looks at Peter. Another way you could say it is to emblepo somebody is to look beyond the surface for the truth that's hidden in the depths. When Jesus first set eyes on Peter, he didn't see who he was. He saw who he had it in him to be. He saw who someday he would become. Now, here's the great thing about this word. I grew up my whole life being taught that that look that Jesus gave Peter was a look of, "I told you so." Was a look of, friends, it was a look of love. It was a look of, I still see who you have it in you to be. I don't see you for the mess you've made. I don't see you for your failure. I see the truth that's still in there. You know this look because some of you are parents. When my firstborn was small, we got this video. My wife was just talking with her while she's cooing and doing what babies do. But there's this moment in the video where the two of them lock eyes. And if you'll notice, my daughter is absolutely transfixed by her mother's gaze. And what we know developmentally is that children need to be looked at this way in order to grow healthy and develop and become the capable, competent children that they will be. And when they don't, I love that. When they don't get this look, they don't become who they have it in them to be. The gaze is crucial. One developmental psychologist, a guy by the name of Kurt Thompson, says this: every human being, their deepest drama is looking for someone who is looking for us. And what you need to understand about Peter's experience of failure is that in his most crushing moment of failure, Jesus looked at him like this. And friends, in your most crushing moment of failure, Jesus looks at you with this same gaze. He doesn't see you for what you've done. He doesn't see you for the mess you've made. He sees you for who you have it in you to be. It's a book called Art and Fear by two art professors, and they teach ceramics. And each semester, they do the same thing in their ceramics class. They will take the class and they'll divide it down the middle, and to all the students seated over here, you are the quantity group. Your only responsibility is to submit 100 pounds worth of ceramics, and you get to submit the best one that you create out of all that 100 pounds. But to this side of the classroom, you only get to submit one ceramic. And you have all semester to think about it and to try to get it perfect. And what do you think they find year after year after year? What they find is that it seems that while the quantity group was busily churning out piles of work and learning from their mistakes, the quality group had sat theorizing about perfection and in the end had little more to show for their efforts than grandiose theories and a pile of dead clay, because failure is essential to your formation. You cannot and you will not become the person that God has intended you to be, the person that God has purposed for you to be, without walking through this painful valley that we call failure. It is how God works in us, and it's how God shapes us. And I don't think it's fair, when we read the Bible, to look in on the failures of the people in the Bible without being honest about our own. So I want to tell you a story of crushing failure from my life. The first 10 years of my career, I was a pastor at a large megachurch in West Michigan. And I started to learn to preach and teach sometime, like I said, around probably 2005. And one July 4th, right, the teaching pastor was gone on vacation, and he came to me and he said, "Hey, I'm going to be traveling. How would you like to teach on July 4th?" And I was like, "I would love to. That's what I do. That's what I'm wanting to be. It's what I'm wanting to do." And so I got on the schedule to teach. But mind you, at this point, I'd given like 3 sermons in my life. I think the person who spoke the week before me was John Ortberg. Okay? Here's what I learned really quickly. It is not cool to learn how to ride a bike in front of thousands of people. I would say it this way. The sermon wasn't awful, but it wasn't mediocre either. It was not good. And I'm up there in front of thousands of people. And you know that feeling? We all kind of have a sixth sense for it in a room when it's like, dude, just tie it off. Like, you need to be done, exit stage right. We're all just waiting for you to be done talking so we can get out of here. And I'm standing there trying to finish my sermon, and I can see that on people's faces. I can feel it in my body, and it was absolutely devastating. And I got down after the prayer, and I sat in the front row completely humiliated and dejected. And we were doing communion that day. And so people are walking past me for like the next 10 minutes. And as people are coming forward for communion, I feel this note card drop in my lap. And I looked up just in time to see who it was, and it was this guy who had started coming to our church after we did a teaching on pornography. And so we had that Sunday. I showed up the next Monday, and I had a phone call from this guy, and he said, "Hey, I'm an elder at another church in town, and I can't talk about my sin with my community. Can you help me? Would you be willing to walk with me?" And over the span of like 5 years, we started to like journey into his story and piece together some of the puzzle of what was really going on with his addiction to pornography. And it came from this really, really broken childhood where he just was not loved well. And as we journeyed together, there was this book by a writer I'm sure many of you know, Henry Nouwen, called Life of the Beloved. And it's all about the way God sees Jesus. And when Jesus comes up out of the waters at his baptism, God announces from heaven, "This is my son, who I love. With him I am well pleased." And over the course of these 5 years, this man had learned to see himself that way. He had learned to see himself with the Father's eyes. And when I left that church to move to Florida, he was leading a group to other men caught in an addiction to pornography with his wife, who was ministering beside him to other women whose boyfriends and husbands were caught in this addiction. And they just had this beautiful ministry together, and it came out of this intense failure. And I saw this guy walk away as I'm sitting there in my own smoldering failure. And I opened up the index card, and it was just this. And this is what Peter experienced in that courtyard. When he locks eyes with Jesus, it's not disappointment. It's not "I told you so." It's, "Buddy, I know you got it in you. I believe in you. You are my beloved." And I think that kind of love makes us capable of being willing to do hard things, of being willing to summon the courage to go to hard places. And so Peter's experience of disappointment and his experience of failure, they launch him into this kind of life where he can say to other people who are hurting, "I want you to suffer well." So let's do this. Let's take a quick bathroom break and just like take five to 10 minutes here. Go use the bathroom, get some coffee, get something to drink, and we'll come back and we're going to deal with 2 more ideas here from the letter of 1 Peter. All right, let's continue. Now that we're really into it and we know each other and we're vibing, we can go to some hard places. And I'll tell you, so I got in yesterday at like noon and went straight to my Airbnb and worked for like 5 hours. And I personally I feel like if my life's work had a core idea, this next talk that we're going to do is it. But it's hard. It's a hard thing to talk about. It's hard to like move into. And I just want to acknowledge that out of the gate. But the reason I want to talk about it is we're looking at how does Peter make this transition from, "No, Jesus, I'm not open to suffering," to being willing to suffering and being willing to tell other people you should suffer like Jesus. So I want to talk about the sacredness of suffering. And we're going to move into the book of 1 Peter. We'll start with chapter 2 in verses 18 through 19, where Peter writes, "Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. By the way, side note, slavery in the Roman world was not like the antebellum slavery that we know of. And that's not a defense of slavery in the Roman world. Slavery in the Roman world was awful, but it was something that a lot of people were able to grow up in and eventually save up enough money to move out of. And there were some cases where if you were the slave of a really wealthy person, you could achieve a pretty significant level of education. And even though you were a slave, you would have a better life and be of higher status than some other freeborn people. So most of the people who are coming to Christ are slaves. And one of the realities that you have to grapple with in the New Testament is that this harsh treatment, sometimes masters would marry slaves together so that they could produce slave babies. And another dynamic is that at any moment, if you are a slave, if you have a master who is harsh and that master wants to be sexual with you in any way, shape, or form, male or female, he is able to do that with absolutely no repercussions. So when you come to passages in the New Testament where Peter is talking about divorce and remarriage, Paul is talking about divorce and remarriage, you've got to understand there are 4 different kinds of marriage in the Roman world. One of those forms of marriage was, I have been married to another slave. But now my master is sexually abusing me and I'm guilty of adultery. What do I do? And there's nothing I can do to stop it. These are the kinds of dynamics that Paul is trying to sort through and to work out. And so there's just so much depth and complexity, and slavery was so hard. That's the kind of depth these people are dealing with. And Peter says to them, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. For it is a credit to you if, being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly. If you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, what credit is that? But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that free from sins we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were going astray like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and the guardian of your souls. These are hard words for where these people find themselves. These are hard to swallow, hard to accept. And I just want to point out 2 kind of dimensions of what Peter's saying. The first comes from verses 20 and 21, where he uses this word endure. And if you look back, actually, 1 verse previous, that word shows up again. So it shows up 3 times in this short little section. And just if you're taking notes, this is an interesting thing to note. The repetition of a phrase in the Bible is always an indication that this is a main point. But when a phrase is repeated 3, 5, or 7 times, it is an indication of a key biblical theme that you will find all throughout the story of Scripture. And this word endure, it shows up 3 times. And so this is one of those places where it's just so helpful to know the language. And for those of you who are like, I would love to know the language of the Bible, but I didn't study Greek or Hebrew. If you're not familiar with it, there is a website called blueletterbible.org. And if you go there, it will do all the work for you. including click a button and it'll pronounce the word for you. And you can see other places that word shows up. You can see what that word means. It is an incredible, incredible tool. And so what this word endure means, this key biblical theme that actually shows up all throughout the New Testament, it's this word hupomeno, and it's a combination of these two Greek words, hupo and meno. Hupo meaning under, meno meaning to remain. So to remain under. Or another way that you might say this would be to remain seated in your heart. So when somebody does something to you, something irritating, antagonizing, painful, how do we want to respond? We want to react. We want to explode. We want to jump up out of the seat of our heart. And Peter says, I want you to remain seated in your heart. So I found this interesting. A number of years ago, was talking with a friend about this word, and he was like, oh my gosh, I literally just read an article about college basketball coaches and how college basketball coaches are trained to deal with their athletes when hard fouls take place on the basketball court. So I want to show you a clip where we watch a hard foul, and I just want you to watch how the players respond. Okay, question. Did you hear when he hit the floor, the audience respond? What do you think everybody in the arena did when that happened? They stood up. Everybody stood up out of their seats. Now, the players as well. Now, I want to play the clip for you again, and it's going to freeze at the end, and I want you to watch the upper left-hand corner of the screen to see what the coach is doing. See what that coach is doing? He's pushing them back into their seats. Because college basketball coaches have been trained, if your players lose their composure and they run out on the court, they will not regain it. The game is over. And so there's just this sense of like when stuff goes sideways, when stuff goes south, stay seated so you can remain in the game. Now, I was doing this same teaching at a different church about 3 months ago, and there were riots happening in France for whatever reason. And I happened to come across this ridiculous viral video of this man who was caught in the middle of this riot. And this is like the most French thing ever. So I just want to play this for you. Man eats sandwich undisturbed. There's a riot. There's police and riot gear. There's rocks being thrown. There's dumpster fires. And this dude is just enjoying a baguette. And here's what you got to understand about this word, hupomeno, in the New Testament. It gets used over and over again for Christians who find themselves in situations of persecution, especially in the letter of Revelation, the letters to the 7 churches. And it's just this idea that when stuff starts going south around you, that you would be so formed and shaped by the way of Jesus that you don't react, you remain. You train yourself to respond to adversity and suffering by becoming patient. It's interesting. In the first 3 centuries of the church, none of the church fathers wrote treatises on evangelism, but they wrote multiple treatises on Christian patience. And they did this because they understood that if you embody the patient love of Jesus, you won't have to tell people about him. They will be compelled by what they see. And this is what formed and shaped. And so you start to see this theme all over the New Testament, where in James 1 verse 2, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy. I just think that's a bad idea. Or Paul in the letter of Romans, and not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings. This is something we boast about because we know it produces endurance, and endurance character, and character hope, and hope does not disappoint us because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that's been given to us. And then you find in Philippians, Paul's writing to the church at Philippi, who's undergoing some similar persecution, for he has, and there's this word, graciously granted. It's one word in Greek, charizomai. God has given you this precious gift to suffer. How does suffering become a gift? But somehow for Paul, for Peter, and the writers of the New Testament, suffering had become a profound gift and the primary way they witnessed to the power of the resurrected Christ in the world. And I think that if we were to sit together over a meal and talk about it, we all probably have stories of what we would call suffering love. I think suffering love is one of the most powerful, indestructible forces in the world. And suffering love is simply when you believe in something so deeply you're willing to bleed for it. How many of you know somebody who has a job that is incredibly hard? They are holding out on these front lines that are just bleak and dark. I was on the board for a child advocacy center for a number of years in Central Florida. Over 30% of all the child abuse perpetrated against children in Central Florida comes to this place. And most of the ladies who work there have worked there for 10 years or more. They have seen such darkness. And yet they hold out on these awful front lines, and they continue to witness powerfully to this hope in the world. And we all know people like this. This is my friend Sherry Osley and her husband Ken. They helped me to launch the church that we were a part of in Ocala. And Sherry launched a school, a private Christian school in Ocala called Ambleside School of Ocala. And I don't know if you've ever started anything, but starting things is just hard. I don't care if you're starting a church, you're starting a business, you're starting a practice, you're starting a habit. Starting things is just hard. Starter energy is hard to come by, and you can run out of it. And I remember talking with her because it was just like, I'm starting a church, you've started a school, I see the wounds in you that I'm experiencing in myself right now. And we would have these conversations. And she said, yeah, had I known what it would cost me, I don't know if I would have done it. But this side of the suffering, I wouldn't trade it for anything, and I would go back and do it in a heartbeat. Because I believe so deeply that this is what God has called me to and that this is what the world needs. Sign me up. I am there for that any day of the week. I will jump in a trench with somebody and I will make this happen again. And that is just this beautiful picture of suffering love that we're called to. And suffering somehow can draw this out of us, and that can become a kind of grace. Now, the second thing that's happening in these passages that we read just a moment ago from 1 Peter 2 is Peter has spent time with Jesus, a lot of time with Jesus on the road. And remember that a disciple is basically an apprentice, a practitioner of Jesus' way. There was this early blessing that may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. And the idea was that as your rabbi walks along these dusty roads of Galilee, that you'll be so close on his heels that the dust that gets kicked up from his sandals, it's going to cover you. And we'll be able to look at the disciples at the end of the day and know who was paying attention, who was hot on Jesus' heels. And we know that Peter has spent a lot of time with Jesus because he's teaching like Jesus. He is doing in 1 Peter chapter 2 what is called remez. Let me hear you say remez. Remez in Hebrew means hint. So as difficult as this is to imagine for us 21st century people, most first century Jews, including children, had vast portions of the Hebrew scriptures committed to memory. And because they had vast portions of the Bible committed to memory, Jewish teachers could make a quote, just a partial quote to one portion of scripture, and they could expect that their audience would know the rest of that quote, right? So if I say to you, an apple a day keeps the doctor away, you know that is remez. Now, when the baby I showed you just a minute ago, our oldest, Braylon, when she was about 3 years old, my wife was giving her a bath, and Braylon was splashing in the water, and she said to my wife, there was a cup on the side of the tub. She said, "Give me that cup." And my wife said, "Excuse me? Give me that cup?" My 3-year-old said, "Now?" "No, give me that cup." And she gave her another chance. And like a good pastor's kid, this 3-year-old said, "In the life of Jesus?" But what my wife was trying to do with her was remez. I'm giving you a chance. Here's the beginning. You know the end. And that's exactly what Peter is doing when he talks about suffering in 1 Peter chapter 2. He's doing remez, and he expects that his audience is going to be able to fill in the blanks. And what he's referring to is this poem. It's a single poem in the book of Isaiah, chapters 40 through 55. And this poem, if you read Isaiah 40 through 55, basically is this: God, everything has gone wrong. Nothing's going the way it's supposed to. And God says, I know, but it's actually okay because I'm going to sort it out, and here's how. It's an amazing poem. And the pinnacle of the poem is Isaiah chapter 53. And if you know anything about Isaiah chapter 53, it is the song of the suffering servant. It is the song about how the Messiah is going to come and he will be the one who suffers. And so when you start to piece through 1 Peter chapter 2, in 1 Peter 2:22, he's quoting Isaiah 53:9. Verse 23, Isaiah 53:7. Verse 24, Isaiah 53:5 and 12. Isaiah 53, it's just everywhere Peter is saying, listen, as you're suffering, remember, Jesus suffered too. It's why he came, and as you suffer, I want you to suffer like him. He goes on in, I think it's 1 Peter chapter 4, where he just says, Jesus has given you a model of what it is to suffer. Now arm yourselves with that same intention. Go into life with a willingness to suffer like him. Now here's what is amazing. Peter learned remez from Jesus, and we actually have a remez in the New Testament of Jesus teaching scripture while he himself was suffering. Now, some of you may have heard this before, but if you look in Matthew's gospel and Mark's gospel, Jesus' last words as he's dying on the cross in those two gospels are, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And if you know your Hebrew scriptures like Jesus' audience would have, they would have recognized, that is Psalm 22, verse 1. Jesus is quoting the Bible while he hangs on the cross. But when you do a remez, you expect that your audience is going to fill in the blank. They're going to fill in the rest of the context. And when you don't understand that that's what's going on, what happens is we misinterpret Jesus' last words on the cross. And so a number of scholars have said, yeah, when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's giving voice to the fact that he has been abandoned by God. That God has turned his back on him because he's taken on the sins of the world, and God can't abide sin. And so God abandons Jesus on the cross. And the theological idea behind this is called the cry of desolation. And it's almost like this picture, and I've got this picture here from the movie Platoon, of this guy who dies with outstretched arms, alone and abandoned by his own. This is the picture that most of us, I grew up being taught, this is what is meant by my God, why have you forsaken me? But Jesus is quoting Psalm 22, and he's not just quoting Psalm 22. Jesus anticipates we're going to be able to fill in the whole psalm. In fact, John's gospel, John is written much later than the other gospels. The last words that Jesus says on the cross in John's gospel are, "It is finished." And that is also a reference from Psalm 22. So let me read to you from Psalm 22. I just want to read the last couple. We'll start in verse 22 if you are following along. I think it's verse 22. So verses 1 through 20, there are all kinds of references in this that if you read through it, you'll recognize from the Gospels. They get repeated, but they show up in Psalm 22. And then the psalm takes a turn at verse 22. I will declare your name to my people. In the assembly I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you descendants of Jacob, honor him. Revere him, all you descendants of Israel. For he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. From you comes the theme of my praise in the great assembly. Before those who fear you, I will fulfill my vows. The poor will eat and be satisfied. Those who seek the Lord will praise him. May your hearts live forever. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before him. For dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. All the rich of the earth will feast and worship. All who go down to dust will kneel before him. Those who cannot keep themselves alive. Posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it. And in the Hebrew, it's in the past tense, meaning you could translate it, it is finished. Jesus is quoting Psalm 22 as he dies on the cross to teach us what it looks like to suffer. And what he says is, as he's hanging on the cross, this is not a cry of desolation. I have not been abandoned by my God. My God has been faithful, and he will vindicate me, and it is a cry of confidence. He doesn't die alone, abandoned, betrayed with outstretched arms. He dies suffering with confidence because he knows that he has just won the victory, and his God will be faithful to make sure that this is the case. Jesus' last words aren't a cry of desolation, but a cry of confidence that suffering, love, has defeated the power of sin and death. Now, I want to bring this home for us, and I want to be very careful here about what I am not saying. I don't think Peter is saying, go out and suffer. Go look for suffering. Go look for persecution. I don't think he's saying that. And I am not trying to romanticize suffering. Some of you in this room have undergone some really horrific things, and I am not trying to airbrush them. I'm also not trying to slap a cliche on heartache and just do a Jesus juke and let's move forward. I'm also not telling you that when you suffer, you should just stuff your pain and just trust God. In 2004, my friend and brother-in-law, who'd been married to my sister for 4 months, he was 20 years old. They did their honeymoon. He got on a plane. He flew to Iraq, and he was killed by an IED in the first 30 days of his deployment. Some of the things that Christians said to me as our family grieved that devastating loss were so alienating. I think often what happens is we don't know what to do with pain. And so when we don't know what to do with pain, a lot of times we either just slap a cliche on it so that we can move forward. Actually, I've talked with a number of people who've gone through tragedy, and they tell the experience of being the person who's at the funeral who's most affected, but you feel like you're comforting everybody else. Because they just want to come up, say their thing, feel better. Okay, I've dealt with that. Now I can move on with my life. And you're still sitting there in the grief. Or because we don't know what to do with pain, we just don't do anything. And so people don't say anything to you. They just avoid you. And I don't want to say any of those things about pain. Pain happens, and I think if we try to give an answer to it, it can actually be alienating. I don't know why bad stuff happens, but here's what I know. When you suffer and you get hung up on why, you don't get an answer to it. We will never find out this side of heaven why that happened. And at some point in the grief process, you have to shift from the question, why did this happen, to what now? If there's going to be meaning to this, it's going to have to come from a decision that I make to give it meaning in spite of how awful it is. And so I don't like this, but I know that it's a truth. And it's a truth that all of us, if you have breath in your lungs, are going to walk through, is that so often we want God to rescue us from suffering, but so often God rescues us through suffering. And this is what had happened for Peter as he realized, oh, this is who Jesus is. This is what he's up to. He's about this bigger story of conquering sin and death, and he does it not by conquering death, but by undergoing it and exploding it from the inside out. So this is a man named Frederick Buechner. He's a writer. He passed away a couple of years ago. When Frederick Buechner was young, his father committed suicide in the garage. And it had a devastating impact on Buechner's life. And he was at a Christian conference, and he was telling his story. And he told the story of his father's suicide and how it had impacted him. And after his talk, somebody came up to him and said, gosh, you've had a lot of suffering in your life, but you've been a good steward of it. And that expression just absolutely bowled him over. The stewardship of pain. We think and talk about stewarding money. We think and talk about stewarding relationships and influence. But brothers and sisters, if the suffering servant is our king, that we are meant to become practitioners of his way, what Peter is saying is learn to steward your suffering. Because if you can be the kind of person who in the face of suffering doesn't jump up out of the seat of your heart and fly off the handle and react, but you channel the patient love of Jesus in your suffering, my gosh, that more than anything will compel the world to this way. They will see that this is a better way. And so I just want to leave you with this idea. Become a steward of your suffering. It's the most powerful evangelism you'll ever do. And I feel like I just need to pray before moving on to the next one. So would you join me for a moment in prayer? God, I I can feel in my body right now remnants and old wounds from my own story and my own pain. And there's just this thing, it's like the pain in me recognizes the pain in others. And God, I feel in this moment, I think by the power of your Spirit, the pain that's in this room. And God, as we seek to be like these people in Asia, like Peter, those who follow you, who confess that we want to live your way, I just ask that you would give us the courage, that you would give us the endurance to remain seated, to suffer well, to suffer like Jesus. God, whatever in our heart resists, I just pray that you would smooth it out and that you would do it with kindness and gentleness, that you wouldn't wreck us along the way, but you would give us just these little foretastes and these little glimpses of your goodness, that you're with us, that you know what it's like because you've been there. You've already walked the path ahead of us. And it's actually okay because you're going to sort it out and you actually already have. So Holy Spirit, I just pray that you would pour your loving presence into the wounds and the aches that we have with us in this room, and that you would, better than healing them, you would transform them into a portal through which you will now breathe new life into the world. May you take our wounds and use them to bring your kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. In the strong, suffering, and vindicated name of your Son, Jesus, we pray. Amen. All right. What a little Oprah on you there for a moment, but I got 18 minutes. We're going to get through this last one because I feel like we can't stop on a heavy note like that. So we're going to lighten it up by talking about Christian political theology. All right? So, 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the exiles. And we talked about this morning. It's kind of a weird way to start the letter because if we go on a map to where all these places are, they're in Asia Minor. These people aren't exiles. This is where they live. They live in Asia. They live in Galatia. That's where they were born. It's where they've grown up. Yes, they're not citizens of the Roman Empire, but they're living in their hometown. But what Peter has said to them is when you said yes to Jesus, you underwent a fundamental shift in your identity, and now your home is not really quite your home. Your home is not what it's meant to be. So he starts by calling them exiles, even though they're not exiles. And then he finishes the letter and he signs off by saying, your sister church in Babylon. Well, Babylon hasn't existed for hundreds of years. Peter's not in Babylon. Peter is in Rome. Peter is writing this letter from Rome. And this is really cool. If you want to get an idea for some of what these first century places like Corinth and Ephesus and Rome, you can go into YouTube and search like AI visual reconstructions of Rome in the first century, and you can find this kind of stuff. That's really, really incredible. But Peter's writing from Rome, and he says Rome is Babylon. Now, if you have like kind of an Old Testament memory, when you hear the word Babylon, you need to be thinking of the empire of Babylon that conquered the kingdom of Judah in 586 BC and burned the temple to the ground. Now, there were a number of deportations that happened, but the most crushing one was in 586 BC, where they burned the temple to the ground and they brought all of these people, they force marched them. You're moving from Jerusalem, you're coming to Babylon. And so Babylon becomes like this symbol. And exile becomes this identity, really, for the people of Israel, the children of Israel. And so when you look back through the scriptures, you even get a feel for exile in the book of Genesis. So we're made for the garden. God creates this good world. He calls it good. That word gets repeated 7 times in chapter 1. So many times that when we get into chapter 2 and there's something that's not good, it's like the record player screeches to a halt. Like, wait a second, this world is good. What is this one thing that's not good? It's that there's no ladies, okay? And so God says, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you this woman. Quick side note, man, too many rabbit trails here. Suitable helper. When God says to Adam, I'm going to give you a suitable helper, it's this phrase in Hebrew, Ezer Kenegdo. Ezer means helper, but it's a word that is often used of help that only God gives. And Kenegdo is a combination of 3 Hebrew words that means one who stands in front of and opposes. So what that means, gentlemen, is that God has not gifted you with the help. God is helping you by providing you with this woman who loves you enough to get in your face and stand in your way sometimes and say, no, I will not let you go that way because I know who you have it in you to be. It's a totally different picture of marriage, of this relationship between male and female, but that's at work there in the garden. So the garden, we're made for it. It's our home. And God says, I want you to obey me with respect to this tree, and they don't. And they get banished from the garden. They get sent eastward into exile, east of Eden. And then God raises up these slaves out of Egypt. He brings them to the desert. He makes them into a nation. He enters a covenant with them, and he says, you're going to be my kingdom of priests, a holy nation. I've got this land for you. I want you to live there and show all the world what I'm like by living a different, holy kind of life. And they get to the land, and they don't. They blow it. They engage in idolatry. They look like everybody else. And so God sends first the Assyrians in 722 to wipe out the northern tribes of Israel. And then in 586, the Babylonians come to town and they crush Judah and they wipe it off the map and they take all these people into exile. Well, then the Persians conquer the Babylonians and Cyrus comes to power and Cyrus says, hey, you Jews can actually go home. And so they go home, but they're not in charge. So they're home, but they're not home. And really, over the span of 1,400 years, it's just this revolving door of world empires that keep conquering them. And so by the time we get to the 1st century, Rome is the new empire in town, and they're living at home, but it is doggone it, it's not home. They're taxing us like crazy. People are losing their family estates, their family inheritance. A Roman soldier can come up to you and interrupt your wedding and say, I need you to carry my pack for a mile. And believe me, they did it. They would interrupt weddings. They would interrupt funeral processions to say, come with me, to antagonize, to spur on. And so it's like we're home, but we're not home. And so what Peter's doing by calling them exiles and by calling Rome Babylon is he's essentially saying Babylon is a metaphor for arrogant human empires that overstep and begin to make ultimate claims. They begin to claim for themselves a power and a position that belongs only to one person, and that is the resurrected Jesus, who is ascended to heaven and seated at the right hand of the Father, and who is now actively ruling the world, which is why they said Jesus is Lord. And if you say Jesus is Lord, what you also mean is, and Caesar's not. And if you weren't here this morning, one of the things that I said, and sometimes this is a misconception about the Roman Empire, because of what we know about Christian persecution, the Romans didn't care if you worshiped Jesus. They had no problem with it. They were perfectly fine with people worshiping other gods. If you want to believe in a Jesus who whisks you off to heaven when you die, go for it. That is no problem. But the minute your Jesus has a claim here on earth, and you start not showing up at the games, the spectacles, the festival meals, the temples, and you don't show up to the guild feasts, and you have love feasts where the social order gets upended when slaves are sitting next to free people and the people of low status are at the head of the table, well, you're turning the empire upside down, and we will not stand for that because Caesar is Lord. But no, Jesus is Lord, and there's this conflict. And so Peter says in Chapter 2, verse 11, "Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that though they may malign you as evildoers, they see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to judge." And this is one of the uncomfortable realities that we have to wrestle with. If you faithfully witness to the way of Jesus in an empire, and by the way, if Peter were writing today and he said Babylon, do you know which country he would mean? He would mean us, without question. If you faithfully witness to the way of Jesus in empire, you will look weird. You will stand out. And so one of the questions that we have to wrestle with that's really uncomfortable as followers of Jesus is, are we as weird as we should be? Or do we just fit in a little too well? This is a guy by the name of Clarence Jordan. He was a Southern Baptist pastor in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And in the late 1940s, he and his family moved from up north, and they bought a farm in rural Georgia in the late 40s, where they launched a community called Koinonia Farms, where they began living in Christian community with their African American brothers and sisters in rural Georgia in the 40s. How do you think that's going to go as the civil rights movement rolls through town? It goes like this.
The Ku Klux Klan, they burned a cross at my mama's house.
They were shot, they were bombed, they were burned, they were dynamited.
They didn't like it by black people living down here.
My perception is that Clarence came back down into southwest Georgia, his native land, with the zeal of a missionary, and not to pick a fight, but to demonstrate a different way of living.
He was a man that didn't believe in segregation and discrimination. He treated me as a human being.
I think he went down there as a very passionate, optimistic, faith-driven person who thought he could really make a difference in his own home country.
And that's how it went. They were boycotted. Their property was shot at. All kinds of horrible stuff. Guys, if you are faithful to the way of Jesus, it's going to create sparks. And I just think one of the questions we got to ask is my witness creating the kind of sparks it should? Now, Peter goes on to say, for the Lord's sake, for goodness sake, for Jesus' sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether of the emperor as supreme or of governors, as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to praise those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing right you should silence the ignorance of the foolish. As servants of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. Now, many of the people he's writing to are slaves. They're not free. But he's saying, in Christ, you are free. And they're going to have to grapple with this dynamic. Live as free people, but don't use your freedom as a pretext for evil. Honor everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God and honor the emperor. And so we are called, as followers of Jesus, to live with this dual identity. We live in an empire where we are citizens. And the scriptures tell us again and again, take that seriously. Honor the institutions that God has put in place in your country. And yet, your true citizenship, Your real freedom comes from heaven. You are a citizen of the kingdom of heaven, and that's not some far-off place we go when we die. It is a reality that exists presently. Jesus is Lord right here, right now. And so when you live in an empire, and an arrogant empire makes ultimate claims on your life, you got to draw the line. There are places where you got to say, listen, I'm for you. I am here for it. But when you ask this of me, I will not go there. And the question is, how do we be loyal and subversive at the same time? And because the scriptures are filled with stories of Jewish exiles who had to figure this out, we've got a lot of examples. One of them we find in the book of Jeremiah, where the people have just been force-marched from Jerusalem to Babylon. They're living as refugees in the enemy capital. And they're all together wondering, God, why have you done this to us? God, what do you say? How long are we going to be here? When do we get out? And there starts to be this showdown between the prophets in their community. And there are two prophets in Jeremiah chapter 28 and 29 who come to the fore. One of them is a guy by the name of Hananiah. And Hananiah says, don't get comfortable. God hasn't forgotten you. God's going to be faithful. He's going to get us out of here. Get ready to go. And Jeremiah says, that's not true, and you know it. God is going to be faithful, and God is going to get us out of here, but not soon. And in fact, plant gardens, build homes, give your children in marriage, marry people, put down roots. And then he says these words, seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. That word welfare is shalom. In its peace you will find your peace. As you work for the good of this empire that is making these ultimate claims on you, you will experience shalom. And so there is this suggestion, like, engage. Engage. Get involved. Support the governmental institutions that God has placed over you. And then we get a little further in the story of the Hebrew Scriptures. And there is an exile who left Jerusalem, went to Babylon by the name of Daniel. And Daniel is trying to live out Jeremiah's words. And Daniel gets brought into, because he's educated, he knows the language, he gets brought into a governmental position in the Babylonian Empire. He takes on a Babylonian name. He works in the government, but there are a couple times when he is told to do something with his diet and his worship, and he says, I'm sorry, I will not go there. And he puts himself at risk by refusing to engage. He's loyal. He's for you. He's working for the empire. He wants to see it succeed, but at the same time, he's got a firm line, and there are some places I just won't go. And brothers and sisters, we live in Babylon. And we don't always see this, because what exists in our world that wasn't quite the same in their world is there is this veneer of civil religion that has gotten mixed in with our Christianity, with our following of Jesus. And it's sometimes hard for us to be honest about what has happened. And so I grew up, my father is a Southern Baptist pastor at the same church that I grew up going to. And I grew up being taught, it was branded into my consciousness about we are a Christian nation. And I am glad for that. But when you start to look back into our Christian founding fathers, you start to find things like this. This is Thomas Jefferson's Bible. You can go see it at a museum. Thomas Jefferson was a humanist who didn't believe in miracles. So in his own personal Bible, he took a scalpel and he cut out all of the things from Jesus' life that he couldn't get on board with. And we may not actually take a scalpel and remove the parts of Jesus that we don't like from our Bible, but don't we do that in some ways? I like this Jesus. We're like Ricky Bobby and Talladega Nights. I like my Jesus with a tuxedo, and cut off arm sleeves because it's like I'm here to party or whatever. We like to make Jesus in our own image. Now, this one is really uncomfortable. And I was not aware of this until just a couple of years ago. But if you go to the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and you go into the rotunda and you look up at what's at the ceiling there, you will see a painting called the Apotheosis of Washington. And if we zoom in, what you see in this painting is George Washington ascended into the heavens, sitting on the clouds next to Lady Liberty and Lady Victory. It is a scene that is taken from the ascension of Christ. And do you know what the word apotheosis means? It means to make a god of. And we just have to be really clear as followers of Jesus. Yes, we support our country. Yes, we're grateful for what God has given to us. And we want to see it succeed, and we want to serve it in ways that are faithful. But boy, when it comes to this, we got to be very careful about drawing a hard line, because when we go to that place, Jesus is no longer Lord. Now he's a mascot. Now Jesus dances to the jig that you want him to dance to. And this is not okay. And so we have to wrestle with, what does it look like to actually embody our faith in public as loyal subversives? And guess what? This was a question everybody was talking about in the Gospels. And there were 4 options in the first century. And they were these. You fight fire with fire. Get out your swords and your pitchforks, boys. We're going to war. Or you compromise and just make the best of a bad situation and get ahead. Pad your pockets. Do business with the Romans. Work it out with the Babylonians. By the way, did you know many of the Jews did so well for themselves in Babylon, they never came home when they got the chance to. They so assimilated into the Babylonian culture that they didn't leave once they could. Then there is this, let's just withdraw. This thing is going to hell in a handbasket. Let's get out of here. We'll form our own little holy huddle. We'll isolate ourselves from the culture around us, and we'll just be Christians all by ourselves over here. And then there is this argument of, no, we've got to be in the culture, but as we're in it, we have to somehow be separate from it. We have to be in the culture, but not of the culture. And what is so fascinating, when you take these 4 points, almost like a stencil, and you drop them down over the Gospels, what you get is the people Jesus interacted with. The Zealots wanted to fight. The Sadducees and the Herodians were just like, well, we'll just get rich. We'll let the Romans have their way and the Herodians have their way. We'll just get rich. Then you have the Essenes who withdraw and they isolate themselves over in Qumran. And then you've got the Pharisees who say, no, we need to be in the culture, but we somehow need to be distinct. The word Pharisee means separated one. And who does Jesus' theology most align with? It's the Pharisees. Jesus calls us to this really, really hard work of discernment. How do we be loyal but subversive? And there aren't always clear indications of what that looks like. You're going to have to do some discernment. You're going to have to wrestle with the text. You're going to have to wrestle with your community. What does it look like to be faithful to Jesus in public in the midst of empire? Now, how? When we have to resist, how do we resist? What does that actually look like? And Peter tells us, When Jesus was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. And then in chapter 3, verse 9, do not repay evil for evil or abuse for abuse, but on the contrary, repay with a blessing. It is for this that you were called, that you might inherit a blessing. So I need a volunteer to join me up here on the stage for just a moment. If some brave soul would be willing. Yes, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. All right, what's your name? Isaiah. Oh, dude, timely. What a great name. Okay, so what Peter is referencing here is connected to Jesus' teaching on resistance from the Sermon on the Mount, nonviolent resistance, okay? So Jesus gives a couple examples in the Sermon on the Mount about how to do this. One of those is this classic example of turning the other cheek. Now, I grew up being told that turning the other cheek was being a doormat for Jesus. You're just nice. You take it and you just carry on and be nice. But when you dig into the context, that's not what Jesus is doing. Jesus is saying actually something else pretty substantial. So for those of you who are here this morning, you remember that the social hierarchy of the first century was really, really significant. And one of the cultural cues was that you used your right hand to do all of your public interaction with. You ate with your right hand, you did business with your right hand, you shook hands with your right hand. Your left hand, in a world pre-toilet paper, was used for other purposes. You did not engage other people with your left hand. So when Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says, if somebody strikes you on the right cheek, so if I'm going to strike him on the right cheek and I'm using my right hand, what's that going to be? It's going to be a backhand. So would you mind just stepping over here? So if I backhand him, which I'm not going to do, but if I backhand him like this, what happens to your face? It goes this way. Now, turn to me the other cheek. Now imagine I'm angry. What is the most natural thing in the world for me to do? Like this. It would be awkward and weird to do this, right? What Jesus is saying is absorb the blow, don't respond with violence, respond with creative grace and courageous grace by standing your ground and turn the other cheek, because what happens is, if I do what comes naturally and strike you this way, then what I have just communicated socially is that this person is my equal. Do you catch this? If I strike you like this, you're beneath me on the social ladder. But if I strike you like this, now you're my equal. And I've just communicated it to everybody. It's brilliant. It is so brilliant. Thank you, Isaiah. Appreciate it. What Jesus, in essence, is saying is that when you must resist, I want you to do these four things. I want you to absorb the evil that is done against you. And I want you to refuse to respond in kind. Because if you respond to evil with more evil, you have just become a participant in evil. So you need to break the chain by absorbing the evil, refusing to respond in kind, surprise it with some kind of creative, courageous grace that at the very same time exposes that evil for the sham that it is. And this is what suffering love will do. Suffering love will show you what's really powerful and what's not. This is why Jesus walks out of the cross and brushes the dirt off his shoulders and says, I'm still here. I underwent your death and I'm still alive. And Paul describes this as Jesus disarmed the powers and the authorities. He made a public spectacle of them. This is the only Eminem reference I ever do. I'm from Flint, Michigan, so I have to. There's a scene at the end of the movie 8 Mile where Eminem is having a rap battle, as I'm sure you often do, with his nemesis, Papa Doc. And the way a rap battle works is a DJ will lay down a beat, and you've got, I don't know, like 45 seconds. And the whole point is to take that time to come up with a rap to shame, mock, humiliate, and degrade your opponent. And so by the time we get to the end of the film, Eminem is facing off against his nemesis, and he's got to go first, and nobody wants to go first. But Eminem does something unexpected. Instead of rapping about what's shameful, humiliating, and degrading about his opponent, he raps about and owns everything that is shameful, humiliating, and degrading about himself. And he basically gets to the end of the rap and says, "And I'm still here." And when they pass the mic to his opponent, he's got nothing to say because he's been disarmed. It's creative. It absorbs the blow. It doesn't respond in kind. And it's this courageous creativity that exposes that evil for the sham that it is. And this is what we're called to when we have to resist empire. So I want to give you 3 concrete examples for how we might do this, and then we'll be out of here because we're about 10 minutes over. So first one, if you are a student, if you are a middle school student, if you are a high school student, you are very familiar with school shootings. There was one 40 minutes from my house just this week in Georgia. My children know some of the people who are in the hospital. It's very scary. And what we learn about every single one of these shootings is that it is a kid who was mercilessly bullied at school. And so this is a story from a group in Canada. This guy sitting at the center of the picture here, his name is David Shepard. One day when he was a high school senior, he and his friend, Travis Price, learned about a freshman who had come to school that day and got beat up for wearing a pink shirt. Now, if you are going to stand up for somebody, what is the most natural thing for you to do to that bully? Well, we're going to go bully him. We're going to go put a pounding on him. We're going to show him. But David Shepard and Travis Price had a different idea. They got on the phones, called everybody in school and said, tomorrow is Pink Shirt Day. And when this kid who was bullied mercilessly shows up at school tomorrow, we want him to walk into a school in a sea of pink and know that he's not alone. And we're not going to go beat up this kid. We're not going to bully this kid, but we're going to send a clear message that that's not okay. And their movement turned into National Pink Shirt Day, which is still practiced in Canada. They absorbed the evil. They refused to respond in kind. They responded with a creative, courageous grace that exposed the evil for the sham that it is. That's the kind of discernment we're called to. I mentioned to you my brother-in-law's death and people saying horrible things. About 6 months after his death, I was traveling in Southeast Asia with some friends. We were doing some work with the International Justice Mission, and we were in Thailand doing undercover work in the sex trafficking trade in Thailand at the time. We'd just seen horrible, horrible things. And I'm with some guys my age, and you know, when you travel, you grow these connections, and we're sitting up in a hotel room in Chiang Mai, Thailand, in the jungle, and we're just talking late into the night. And this other guy who was on the trip with me, he says to me, man, I sense your grief, I sense your anger. Tell me what you're feeling towards God right now. And I did. I'm mad at God, and I uncorked on him, and I told him what I thought of God. And then he started asking me these questions, like leading questions, questions that there was a right answer to, like he was trying to lead me down this path. And eventually he just got frustrated with me, and he said, listen, you're being really selfish. You just need to figure out what God is trying to do through your brother's death. And see, what we want to race people to healing without acknowledging the grief. And it's one of the only times in my life where I would say, the Holy Spirit took over, and the words that came out of my mouth, they were not mine. I don't claim them as mine because I was much a learner from them as anybody else that heard them. But what I found myself saying to this guy who had just done this injustice was, listen, I have been with you now for a week, looking at some of the worst injustice in the world, and I have seen the heartbreak in your eyes. I know that God lives in you and that there is such goodness in you and that you are so disturbed by what is wrong and you are so deeply motivated for what is wrong to be made right that I think what you just said is your desire to see this made right, but you have missed me and you have harmed me in the process. And I want to punch you. I want to do physical violence to you, but I'm not going to. So I'm going to leave. I'm going to go for a walk. But when I come back, I am going to lean in to that broken-hearted, redemptive part of your heart that I know is the truth of who you are. And that's what happened. And a couple years later, he found me one Sunday with tears just streaming down his face. And he said, I'm so sorry. I think I might understand a little bit now. And it's, you absorb that wrong. You refuse to respond in kind. You respond with some kind of creative, courageous grace that exposes it for the sham that it is. And this is what you see most beautifully in the life of Martin Luther King Jr., probably the best practitioner of Jesus' teachings on nonviolence. And what you see in King's words are things like this: to our most bitter opponents we say, we shall match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to what? To endure, to hupomeno suffering. We shall meet your physical force with soul force. Do to us what you will. We shall continue to love you. But be ye assured that we will wear you down by our capacity to suffer. One day we shall win freedom, but not only for ourselves. We shall so appeal to your heart and conscience that we shall win you in the process, and our victory will be a double victory. And what the nonviolent resistance of the civil rights movement was this refusal to respond to evil by doing more evil. It remained loyal, but it drew a line and said, we're not going to stand for that. And we will be creative, and we will be courageous, and we will live our faith in public. And if it's costly, then suffering love will be the thing that wins the day, because Jesus has died, but he has risen, and he has ascended to heaven, and he's the true Lord of the world, not Caesar. So brothers and sisters, as you seek to live your faith in an empire, be loyal to authority, work for the good, but resist when necessary. And if you resist, do it with cruciform love. Absorb, refuse, surprise, expose. I didn't realize this when I put that together, but the acronym is ARSE. And I'll just leave you with this. I believe that Jesus wants us to get our arse in gear and represent him well in the world. Thank you guys so much for hanging with me for an extra 20 minutes. Have a great week and go in peace.